So this is a revision video on hemoglobin. 7 revision questions for you to do. So pause the video, do those, and we will go through answers. Okay, so remember the important thing is using keywords and concepts in your answers. So I will put those words that you should have in there in bold to remind you to make sure you use those words. So let's start with question 1. You should have been thinking of this structure of hemoglobin, and this should have been your answer for the structure. You'll notice I've underlined ion there. So anytime you're talking about an ion, and if you're writing, for instance, Fe2+, you need to say ion after that. So really important that you do that. Hydrogen ions, if you write H+, you need to write ion after that. Sodium ions, if you write Na+, don't just write the Na+, you need to write ion after. And so function of hemoglobin. Remember to refer to the partial pressures of gases when you're talking about hemoglobin. Okay, let's go on to question 2. So the graph you should have drawn should be this. Remember, it's this classic S-shaped graph for oxygen dissociation curve for hemoglobin. And remember, this is for human adult hemoglobin. So answer to question 3. So let's look at this on the graph just to put it into context. So if we look at the partial pressure when it's of oxygen at 15 kilopascals, so a high partial pressure, let's draw a line on the graph there, we can see that the O2 saturation of hemoglobin is high, so it's almost 100%. But then when the partial pressure of oxygen is low, so let's look at around 3 kilopascals partial pressure of oxygen, we can see that most of the oxygen is dissociated from hemoglobin. So there's only about 11% there. This is a really important characteristic. So it's really important to understand this relationship between partial pressure of oxygen and saturation of hemoglobin with oxygen. So question 4, positive cooperativity. So your answer should look like this. Well, we start with the graph. And so I'm showing you the first part of the curve there, which relates to the first part of your answer. So that very shallow slope in that first part that I've put a box around of the graph reflects the fact that it's difficult for that first oxygen molecule to bind. And there's good reason for that. If you've got a low partial pressure of oxygen, you don't want hemoglobin to take the oxygen away, because clearly it's required. It's important you're not taking oxygen away from where it's very low. Second part of the answer. So this relates to the middle part of the curve where we get that steep increase because that first oxygen molecule binding makes it easier for any further molecules to bind. So those second and third molecules of oxygen bind easily. And then finally, so that last part of the curve is actually quite shallow. It's not because it's difficult for that fourth oxygen molecule to bind. In fact, the opposite. It's easy for the fourth oxygen molecule to bind. It's just because there's only one binding site left, there's a lower probability of it binding. So that's why that slope is shallow. So let's look at how the curve changes with different affinities for oxygen. So let's draw the curve here. It's right shifted. What that means is that hemoglobin has a lower affinity for oxygen, and conversely, left shifted means a higher affinity for oxygen. And there are some important ways you need to describe these changes in affinity. So lower affinity actually means it unloads or dissociates more easily, loads associates less readily. And for high affinity, you should be using those phrases. And I've put them in bold because it's really important you use the word loads or associates or unloads and dissociates. So you should recognize that different species have different hemoglobins. So we've looked at human adult hemoglobin, but those different curves with lower and high affinities will be the case for different species. So your answer for question 6 should be this. So you'll see the curve more shifted to the right for animals that have a high metabolic rate, have a high oxygen demand, and left shifted for conditions where oxygen partial pressure is low, such as high altitude or in the fetus. Okay, finally question 7, so the Bohr effect. So your answer should look like this. So I'm showing you the chemical reaction for how carbon dioxide lowers pH. You don't need to actually know that. You just need to recognize that where there's a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide, the hydrogen ion concentration increases, and so that lowers the pH. And the other parts of your answer should have this information. And so on the graph, the Bohr shift or Bohr effect will look like this for when there's an increased partial pressure of carbon dioxide. So it's right shifted. Also, though, it's important to recognize that it can be left shifted when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is reduced, and that will increase the pH. So that's the Bohr effect. So that's the important information you need to know about hemoglobin. So make sure you continue to test yourself until you're getting those answers correct and that you're using those key words and concepts.